She did not hear him enter. That was the cruelest part, that she was already on her knees when he found her, not in prayer, though heaven knew she had exhausted every prayer she possessed in the long, bitter week since her husband's death. No, she was on her knees in the blue drawing-room of Ashford Hall, her silk gown pooling around her like a bruised violet flower, her small daughter pressed to her chest, her face buried in the child's soft dark curls. Lady Cecily Vane, widow of the late Viscount Vane, was weeping, and Edmund Ashford, the 8th Duke of Ravensbourne, was watching. She heard the slow, deliberate sound of his boot heels against the marble floor a moment too late. By the time she raised her countenance, flushed and wet with grief, stripped of every pretension she had ever worn like armor, he was already there, tall, still, unyielding as the granite cliffs of his own northern estate. His grey eyes swept over her with an expression she could not name. It was not pity. Edmund Ashford did not deal in so soft a currency as pity. She rose, unsteady, pulling little Rosalind against her hip. The child was 4 years old, and mercifully unaware that her entire world was in the process of being dismantled around her small, innocent ears. "Your Grace," Cecily said, and her voice, to her immense relief, held only the faintest tremor. "I was not informed of your arrival." "No," said the Duke, "you were not." He crossed the room to the great window that overlooked the frost-bitten gardens that had until a fortnight ago belonged to the Vane estate, and now, by the ruthless machinery of English inheritance law, belonged entirely to him. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his dark coat immaculate, his jaw set as though carved from the same cold stone as the hall around him. Cecily's heart hammered a terrible rhythm beneath her mourning gown. She had known this interview was coming. She had rehearsed it 100 times in the small, cold hours of the night, lying awake in the bed she had once shared with Arthur, listening to Rosalind's soft breathing through the adjoining door. She had prepared elegant arguments, measured appeals to reason and propriety and Christian charity. She had prepared to be composed. She had not prepared to be found crumbling. "I presume," she said carefully, lifting her chin, "that you have come to discuss the matter of the estate." "Among other things," said the Duke, still not turning from the window. "Then I will speak plainly, Your Grace, as I suspect you prefer plainness to ceremony." She drew a slow breath. The candlelight, for the afternoon was grey and grudging with its light, flickered across the mantel, throwing long shadows across the room. "I ask nothing for myself. I have relations in Bath. I can manage. But Rosalind," and here, despite every valiant effort, her voice broke at the edges like thin ice, "Rosalind was born in this house. This is all she has known. I beg you as her mother, do not remove her from it. Not yet. Not so soon after losing her father." The Duke turned, and something in the quality of his silence changed. He looked at the child for a long moment. Rosalind, with the sublime fearlessness of the very young, looked back at him with wide brown eyes and said nothing, only clutched a small rag doll against her chest, in a gesture that was, though none of them knew it yet, entirely her mother's.
"Take anything," Cecily whispered, and she had ceased now to care about dignity. Dignity was a luxury. Her daughter was not. "Take the silver, take the portraits, take every stone of this wretched hall if it pleases you, but leave her this, leave her a little while longer." The Duke was quiet for so long that the fire in the grate seemed to hold its breath. Then, in a voice so low she was not entirely certain she had heard him correctly, he said, "I do not want the silver, Lady Vane." She stared at him. "And I do not want the portraits," he continued, walking toward her now with slow, measured steps, as though approaching something he feared might startle and flee. He stopped, not 3 feet from her. She could see for the first time that the grey eyes she had always dismissed as cold were not, in fact, cold at all. They were careful. They were the eyes of a man who had learned, at considerable cost, to keep his interior life under lock and key. "What I want," said Edmund Ashford, Duke of Ravensbourne, in a voice that carried the weight of something long withheld, "is considerably more inconvenient." Now, dear listener, before we go further into this extraordinary moment, if this story is already pulling at your heart, I want to ask a small favor. Please take just a second to like this video and subscribe to the Duke's Lost Letters. Your support truly means everything. It is what allows us to keep bringing you stories like this one, week after week. And if you know someone who loves a beautiful, dramatic romance, please share this with them. Now, back to the drawing room where the Duke is about to say something that will change Cecily's life entirely. "I beg your pardon," she breathed. "I have been in possession of this estate for exactly 17 days, said the Duke. "In that time I have reviewed every account, every tenancy agreement, every outstanding debt your late husband, God rest him, accumulated over the course of his tenure." He paused. "He was not a careful man, your husband." "No," said Cecily softly, "he was not. But he was, by all accounts, a beloved one." She swallowed. "Yes." The Duke looked at her for a long, searching moment. Then, almost imperceptibly, something in his iron countenance shifted. A fault line, a hairline fracture in the marble. "What I did not come here to do was turn you out," he said. "I came because I have a proposition." The word landed between them like a stone into still water. "A proposition," she repeated, her voice carefully neutral, though her pulse had become a quite scandalous thing entirely outside her control. "A practical one," he said quickly, as though aware of every improper interpretation the word might carry and anxious to outpace them. "I am a duke without an heir, Lady Vane. I am, as my late mother spent the final decade of her life informing me, a man in singular want of domestic arrangement. I am also, as you can observe, entirely without the aptitude for sentiment that might recommend me to most women of feeling." Cecily almost laughed. It came out instead as something that was not quite a sob. "And yet," he continued, and now his voice dropped to something that was no longer remotely practical, "I find, to my considerable inconvenience, that I am not without feeling entirely." He looked at Rosalind again. The child had fallen asleep against her mother's shoulder with the magnificent indifference of the deeply untroubled. "I watched you," he said quietly, "through the window before I entered, for perhaps 5 minutes. You were rocking her and singing something I could not hear, and I thought—" He stopped, began again. "I thought that whatever man had inspired that quality of devotion must have been a very fortunate man indeed, even an uncareful one." The candlelight shivered. The cold draught that crept beneath the library door stirred the hem of Cecily's gown. "What precisely," she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper, "are you proposing, Your Grace?" He held her gaze. "I am proposing," said the Duke, with the air of a man stepping off a great precipice, "that you stay, that you both stay, not as my tenants, not as my charity, but as—" He straightened, squared his shoulders, became for just a moment almost vulnerable in his formality, "as my family, if you would consent to be my wife, Lady Vane." The fire crackled. Rosalind stirred and mumbled something in her sleep about her rag doll. Cecily looked at this man, this cold, precise, lonely man, and understood in a single clarifying instant that his coldness was never indifference. It was armor worn so long he had nearly forgotten the warmth it was built to protect. "You want both of us," she said slowly. "I want both of you," and the simplicity of it, the bare, unguarded honesty, undid her entirely. She was quiet for a long time. The frost pressed against the great windows. The house breathed around them, old and patient and waiting. Then Cecily Vane, who had prepared to beg, who had rehearsed surrender, who had steeled herself for cold dismissal, tilted her head and said very quietly, "Then you had better learn to tolerate rag dolls at the breakfast table, Your Grace." And for the first time in what felt like a great many years, Edmund Ashford, Duke of Ravensbourne, smiled. It was not a large smile, it was barely a smile at all, truly, but it was the kind that lives in a person's memory forever, glimpsed only once in flickering candlelight, in a cold room made suddenly, inexplicably warm.
and Rosalind slept on, dreaming whatever small golden dreams belong to children who are loved, entirely unaware that somewhere between grief and snow and a man's quiet courage, her mother had just found their way home. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Duke's Lost Letters. If Edmund and Cecily's story moved you today, please leave us a comment below. We read every single one. Until next time, dear listener, may you always find warmth in the coldest of halls.